Clowns. Like their archetypal cousins, the fool, the trickster, and the jester, the clown is a sacred dissident, if you will, an honored and seemingly benign transgressor, playfully defying our conceptions of appropriate behavior. The clown invites you to relax your grip on the socially constructed self and embrace the chaos that lies beyond the carefully maintained predictability of your life. It is the clown's presumable ignorance of his own power to dissolve boundaries that once made him such a beguiling and innocuous figure. And while there are still those today who remember and try to preserve the special magic of the clown, recent decades have seen a more disturbing image take hold in the popular imagination. For all too many of us, the superimposed smile painted on his face belies a potentially more sinister set of intentions lurking behind his jovial appearance. But while depictions of evil clowns can be found dating back centuries, there is one real-life person who can be credited more than any other with the clown's fall into disrepute. And his name is John Wayne Gacy. Hello, my name is Kyle, and this is Killer Cosmos. We're looking at John Wayne Gacy's birth chart this week, and I will warn everybody in advance, this one is uncomfortable. It gets pretty dark and, pretty rapey. So if you're particularly sensitive, you may want to skip this one. But for the rest of us who just can't help ourselves, we're going to jump right in. John Wayne Gacy was born March 17, 1942 in Chicago, Illinois at 12:29 a.m. The parents Marion and John Stanley Gacy. John, along with his mother and two sisters, were all subjected to verbal and physical abuse at the hands of Gacy's alcoholic father throughout his childhood. Young John was constantly berated by his father, often in front of his sisters or other kids in his neighborhood, for being, quote, a sissy mama's boy, who would probably grow up queer. When John, at the age of 7, was caught with another boy fondling another young girl, John's father reacted by beating him with a razor strap. This was not an uncommon punishment in the Gacy household. John Stanley Gacy would frequently arrive home from work and immediately head to the basement, only to emerge sometime later completely drunk, often lashing out at young John, seemingly out of nowhere. Gacy, nonetheless, was desperate to please his father, which likely resulted in Gacy internalizing his father's homophobia. At around age 7, Gacy was also molested by a family friend, which likely only served to exacerbate Gacy's sexual confusion. At the age of 12, John revealed to a friend a hidden stash of his mother's underwear that he kept in his closet. Gacy was very close with his mother and his sisters, which only seemed to solidify his father's resentment towards him. He also suffered from numerous health problems, and at age 9, Gacy began having fainting spells and was diagnosed with an enlarged bottleneck heart. In 1957, he was hospitalized for a burst appendix. Gacy never did very well academically, but at age 17 began learning the printing trade. However, after several fainting spells during shop class, it was determined that he could no longer be allowed to work with machinery. Discouraged, Gacy dropped out of high school and began working as an assistant precinct captain for the local Democratic Party. In 1962, fed up with his father's mistreatment, Gacy left home, eventually ending up as a mortuary attendant in Las Vegas. One evening, while working at the mortuary, he was overcome by an irresistible impulse to climb into a coffin with a dead teenage boy, where he laid next to it, caressing the body until eventually being overcome with shock with what he was doing. Freaked out by the experience, he called home and returned to Chicago shortly after. Then, after graduating from the Northwestern Business College in 1963, he took a job as a shoe salesman about 200 miles south of Chicago in Springfield. Finally, on his own, he made a name for himself with the local U.S. Junior Chamber, or the JCs. He climbed the JC's ladder, bringing in large numbers of new recruits through parties he would host featuring drugs, stag films, and prostitutes, eventually becoming vice president. In 1964, he married Marilyn Myers, with whom he had 2 children, and they eventually moved to Waterloo, Iowa, in order to take over management of 3 KFCs Marilyn's parents had purchased. Life really seemed to be turning around for Gacy. He had even gained what he had perhaps sought most in his life up to that point, the approval of his father. However, Gacy had developed an insatiable sexual appetite that could not be satisfied by prostitutes, sex parties, or even wife swapping. Gacy had set up a clubhouse in his basement for the employees of his KFC restaurant. But somehow, invitations only seemed to find their way to the teenage males among them, whom he would ply with drugs and booze and make sexual advances on, sometimes forcibly. And in August 1967, he coerced the 15-year-old son of a fellow JC to perform oral sex on him. The following year, the traumatized boy finally reported the incident to his parents, who immediately pressed charges. And on November 7th of 1968, Gacy was convicted of sodomy and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Gacy's wife, Marilyn, filed for divorce, and he never saw her or his 2 children again. Gacy was further devastated by the death of his father while in prison, which he believed to be the result of shame for Gacy's sodomy conviction. Nonetheless, Gacy was a model prisoner and was paroled on good behavior in June of 1970, having served only 18 months of his 10-year sentence. Gacy returned to Chicago to rebuild his life. By all appearances, Gacy wasted no time in finding new teenage boys to assault. In February of 1971, Gacy was charged with sexual battery of a teenage boy, but the charges ended up being dropped when the boy failed to appear in court. That same year, Gacy moved into the infamous 8213 West Somerdale Avenue, which would eventually serve as the burial site of 26 of his victims. He also established his construction business, PDM Contractors. In the following year, he married his second wife, Carol Hoff, a divorcee and mother of 2 young daughters. However, on January 2nd of 1972, the crawl space under 8213 West Somerdale Avenue received its first human deposit, after Gacy stabbed a 16-year-old boy in the chest. Though the stabbing was allegedly in self-defense, Gacy reported that after stabbing the boy, he achieved a mind-numbing orgasm and learned that death was the ultimate thrill. Over the following years, Gacy rebuilt his reputation as a successful businessman and popular local precinct captain of the Chicago Democratic Party, throwing massive backyard parties, often with hundreds of people in attendance. He committed his second known murder on January of 1974, and on July 31st, 1975, Gacy convinced one of his employees to come home with him on the pretense of settling a dispute over unpaid wages. After offering 18-year-old John Buktovich a drink, Gacy convinced him, in what would become something of a signature move, to allow his hands to be cuffed behind his back. Gacy subsequently tormented the boy for some time by sitting on his chest, before finally strangling him to death. By 1975, as his second marriage ended in divorce, Gacy had begun regularly cruising the streets of Chicago for young male victims, and finding increasingly elaborate ways to torture them. It is clear, however, that Gacy did not always kill his victims. In March of 1978, Gacy kidnapped 26-year-old Jeffrey Rignall, whom he kept suspended in a pillory in his basement for a night of torture and rape, before chloroforming him and releasing him half-naked in Chicago's Lincoln Park. Despite the mounting number of disappearances among the employees of his contracting company, it was not until Gacy lured 15-year-old Robert Peace to his home on the pretext of offering him a job that his murder spree would finally come to an end. Gacy convinced him to put handcuffs on under the pretext of a magic trick, and then strangled him to death using what Gacy called his rope trick. The rope trick involved a sort of makeshift garrote, which amounted to a rope and a sort of short broom handle that, after twisting several times, would firmly lodge itself behind the victim's back, allowing Gacy to stand back and watch them struggle as they slowly died from strangulation. Peace's parents quickly reported Robert's disappearance, and after tailing Gacy for several weeks, police finally had sufficient evidence to search the crawl space under the house on Somerdale Avenue. Gacy was convicted of 33 counts of murder and sentenced to death March 18, 1980. Finally, on May 9, 1994, Gacy was executed by lethal injection. Now, one of the preconceived notions I went into researching Gacy with was that I tended to think that the clown part of Gacy's story was really much more sensationalized than it was, materially relevant to his personal, we'll say, contribution to the world. But, it was kind of understandably emphasized in coverage of him because it really added this kind of extra layer of creepiness and kind of shock value. But I want to, acknowledge it for the role that it did play. As we'll see as we get into the chart, it might have been a much bigger component of what the life of John Wayne Gacy was all about than maybe I thought at first. Gacy essentially got into clowning around 1975, really around when his murder spree was kind of picking up. But he had a couple different clown personas, probably the primary one being Pogo the Clown, who, was a very happy, jovial clown in Gacy's words. And then he had another one that was a little more serious. For the most part, that was kind of a separate thing. He did exploit that when he was in prison. He started painting really rather shitty clown paintings and really selling them for quite high prices. But there was one incident where he really, kind of almost did take on that killer clown role. Around 1976, after his divorce, he was renting a spare bedroom to one of his employees, went by Cram. One day, Cram came home to just a really kind of high and wasted Gacy in just full clown regalia, makeup and everything, and invited Cram to, have a couple drinks with him. And of course, now in his clown outfit, what better time to do his handcuff trick? When Cram asked Gacy to uncuff him, Gacy just kind of started laughing like a little kid. And then Cram threatened to kick Gacy's ass. And then Gacy just started growling like a mad dog, as Cram put it, and just started swinging him around the room, screaming, "I'm going to rape you," giggling in full clown makeup. And I guess Cram managed to knock Gacy down, get the keys, and uncuff himself. And then he just moved out the next day. But that's really the closest that Gacy's clowning, at least kind of literally, and Gacy's more nefarious activities truly overlapped. But, with that said, let's just go over his chart here. So he was born with Sagittarius rising, about 1 degree, 28 minutes. There are no planets in the first, so really want to look at the ruling planet, obviously. And we get Jupiter in Gemini, in its detriment, in the 7th house. There we also have Mars applying to a conjunction with Jupiter at 5 degrees, 51 minutes. Naturally, we're going to want to look at what Mercury's doing, being the ruling planet of Gemini, and we have Mercury at 0 degrees, 17 minutes in its fall in Pisces, in the 4th house. It's also pretty notable that we have the Sun in Pisces in the 4th house, 25 degrees, 59 minutes, and the new moon also in Pisces at 28 degrees, 49 minutes. And we have the South Node also in Pisces in the 4th, hanging out pretty close to the IC at 17 degrees, 54 minutes. Now, this gives us a not super strong, but nonetheless symbolically significant eclipse in Gacy's 4th house, a South Node eclipse. So what's going on there is going to have a lot of influence on, everything else because it's angular, but mainly, Jupiter as well as Mars. There's a mutual reception between Jupiter and Mercury. And then we have Venus in Aquarius at 13 degrees, 36 minutes, applying very tightly to a trine with Jupiter in Gemini. Quite a typically nice, very lovely little aspect. generally regarded as one of the most positive aspects. Astrology, Venus, Jupiter, both benefics. And then we also have Saturn in Taurus in Gacy's 6th house at 24 degrees, 6 minutes, applying to a conjunction with Uranus at 27 degrees, 5 minutes, Taurus. And then finally we have Neptune up in the 10th house, about 28 degrees, 34 minutes, Virgo, in a pretty tight, though just separating opposition with the moon in Pisces. And then we have Pluto in Leo at 3 degrees. And, it's not super tightly configured to anything. I mean, it's in the action. It's technically kind of opposing Venus by sign, but I don't think we're going to get to point too many fingers at Pluto. So, overall, just kind of the hot take or, first glance look at Gacy's chart. It's hard to really see anything really disastrous about it. I mean, there's like some not great stuff, but, just kind of at a broad glance doesn't look too bad. Especially that really, should be a very lovely Venus-Jupiter trine, especially to the ruler of the first house. But, one of the things that kind of occurred to me with Venus and Aquarius and that relationship with Jupiter was the story of Ganymede in Greek mythology, which is a pretty significant element of what Aquarius is all about. Aquarius is identified by the constellation of the Water Bearer, and the story I've always known about Ganymede is that he was this kind of young, very gifted, sort of golden boy prince of Troy, and Jupiter, or Zeus, the god of all gods, was like,
"Hey, other gods, look at this guy. Now that mortal is something special. What do you guys think I make him my cupbearer?"
Everybody's like, yeah, Jupiter, that sounds like a good idea. He's pretty cool. So Jupiter sends for an eagle to fly down and whisk this prince of princes and bring him up to Olympus. And while it's great, getting this special status as Zeus's cupbearer, it's kind of special place of honor, he's still immortal. He's a mortal amongst gods, kind of risen above his fellow man to this high place. But there's kind of a tragedy in occupying this kind of sacred role as cupbearer. He kind of has to live in a sort of isolation, a sort of in-between space, a kind of exile, an honorable exile, if you will, belonging neither to the gods nor to mortals. And you get a lot of Aquarius themes there, sort of surrendering of the self to a higher purpose for the greater good. You get a little bit of a holier than thou vibe too, It's lonely here at the top. But it got me thinking, maybe somehow Gacy's chart was just like the darkest version of that story you could possibly dream up. Gacy being Jupiter with a fondness for kind of bringing in handsome young boys. Like, hey there, guy. I've seen you working. You're a hard worker. How would you like to make $5 an hour? Which was like twice as much as what the minimum wage was at the time. And most of them would be like, golly, sir, sure, of course. And, Gacy would bring them in, make them feel special. And, instead of making them his cupbearer, he drowned them in the tub and raped them. Now, as I did a little more research on that story, turns out there is actually a very, very dark version of that story already. In this other version, often referred to as the rape of Ganymede, Zeus is hanging out up in Olympus and he sees this beautiful, handsome young boy prince. And Zeus, being both lustful and a god of varied tastes, gets just hard as the dickens over Ganymede. It says, I gotta have him. He's gotta be mine. So he turns himself into an eagle and swoops down, whisks the handsome young boy away up to Olympus, castrates Ganymede, and makes him his personal boy love doll. And it's a technically kind of honored position to be so beloved by the gods that one of them just can't help but kidnap you and make you his own personal sex slave. It, kind of sucks for maybe more obvious reasons. But so it goes for our tragic hero, Ganymede. Now, I don't know about you, but from my perspective, that symbolism is kind of hard to ignore. That Venus in Aquarius is starting to look a lot like a nice, sweet teenage Ganymede, and that Jupiter in Gemini, ruling Gacy's first house, is looking a lot like a big, bad, dirty Zeus. But how? Why? Why is that trine so nasty? Why is Jupiter so bad? Why is it that we're getting like an evil Jupiter? I mean, it's Jupiter. It's a benefic, right? Usually has to be in pretty bad condition to become kind of genuinely malefic. But, let's go ahead and see what's up with Jupiter. Jupiter's in Gemini. It's, it's in its detriment. And, a lot of the time when you get the ruler of the first in the seventh, one of the more common manifestations of that is, maybe getting a little overly involved in romantic relationships, losing yourself in relationships, but often kind of discovering yourself through them as well. And while, you might see a little bit of that with Gacy to some degree, kind of more in a broadly social kind of context. Venus is in the third. It's a very social house. Gacy was an extremely social guy. And, really the issue with Jupiter in Gemini, on the positive side, people with Jupiter and Gemini can, sometimes be just really vast repositories of data, facts, Be interested to see how many Jeopardy contestants have Jupiter in Gemini. And it's not really, Jupiter's favorite thing. Jupiter's more of the, Jupiter speaks in metaphors. Jupiter's looking for kind of the broader context of things. I'm a big picture guy. Jupiter likes it kind of big, kind of grandiose. Likes to foster growth, right? Gemini, is kind of archetypally Mercury in Gemini, but, planets in Gemini take on the quality of Gemini. And it's just like a curiosity. Gemini likes the details. It wants to, Gemini wants to know the how and the why and the when and the where. And, both of them, or all three of them, or all seven of them at the same time. It's a little more impulsive. And Gemini likes, tricks too. Kind of likes to find shortcuts. Gemini is interested in all the ways of doing things. It's interested in technique. Likes to be clever. Gemini planets are going to tend to be geared towards finding the most interesting way to do something. But what's interesting can change quite a lot from moment to moment. Well, Jupiter maybe just wants to know the correct way, the right way, the morally correct way. Mercury kind of essentially not a planet that really deals in morality. It can. It's quite adaptable, It'll adapt to its moral environment in a pretty kind of pragmatic way. That's why Mercury, doesn't really have a sect. It's flexible. It's androgynous. It sort of shifts and changes and moves and alters itself to more or less do business, in the environment it's in. Whether that environment is, a nunnery or a basement full of baby-eating cannibals. And Gemini's definitely the more, I want to think of a better word than amoral, but, it's just not really judging or looking at things through a moral lens. That's why Gemini, in my personal opinion, has kind of the creepiest dark side. Kind of think of that movie Funny Games. You may or may not have seen it. I couldn't really finish it, which, might be saying something. But it basically has, these two Gemini young men just having a delightful time horrifically torturing this family and just playing really fucked up mind games with them. Or, maybe more well-known example, sometimes think of Alex from Clockwork Orange, just kind of singing in the rain, kind of gleefully bashing a woman to death with a penis statue in front of her husband. That's like his idea of a good time. It's not a very emotional sign. It might like to play with your emotions. But, other than being in its detriment, what else? That's really not enough to get our kind of kidnappy, rapey Zeus, even though, mythology is a much bigger part of what Zeus did than maybe what Jupiter, the planet, tends to signify. But Jupiter is out of sect. This is a night chart. So, it's in a sense not as powerful, but, it's just not as happy. It's a little more grumpy. His favorite shows aren't on, put too much salt on everything. Just kind of indicates that Jupiter, or, maybe the person in question, is not as, often it's really just, they're just not as mainstream. You can really think about it as, if you're a senator and say you're, a Democrat, but, Republicans have the majority, and really the best you're going to do is get, Senate Minority Leader. You're not going to be the one running the show. It's going to make your pond a little smaller. So, Jupiter's out of sect kind of just by the nature of the chart, but it's also out of sect in terms of its relationship with the sun. So you have the sun below the horizon, which is, by definition, what makes it a night chart, but Jupiter is above the horizon. It's not with the sun. If it's got to be in a night chart, at least wants to be with its homies, Sun, and even Saturn wants to be on with its teammates. And it's not. It's with Mars. Now, in the right situations, it can be kind of good, especially if Jupiter has the upper hand in the relationship. Usually be a really good influence on Mars. And, technically Jupiter is kind of in this technically stronger position of the conjunction. So Mars is applying to Jupiter, which you can kind of think if, you're negotiating a business meeting and you maybe want to swing your dick around a little bit. You might want them to, come to your office and meet with you. So you meet on your own terms. And that's kind of what that's like. The slower moving planet tends to have more of the big dick energy. And, they also tend to be just physically bigger than the faster moving planets like, Mars, Venus, Mercury, the moon. But that's going to depend on a lot of other factors. Like, for one, Mars is of the sect in favor. It's a night planet in a night chart. And, while Mars has that going for it, which is definitely something, otherwise it has kind of some of the same problems that Jupiter has. It's not on its detriment, but it's not in a sign that it does particularly well in. I mean, it can in certain circumstances, of course. But, Mars in general doesn't do great with air. You ever tried throwing punches at air? You can't. In fact, if you do it too much, you're going to throw your shit out of whack. Mars needs like some substance to kind of push forward or push around. It wants some meat to drive its sword into, if you will. But it's not a planet naturally suited to kind of mind intellectual sphere that the element of air is associated with. Mars in air signs tends to indicate kind of hyper mental activity, an overheating of the mind, a bit of a spinning of the wheels, but not really finding traction or road for them to really get you going forward. But also, like Jupiter, Mars is kind of out of sect by its relationship to its sect luminary, the moon. The moon, also would rather be above the horizon. It doesn't want to be on the same side of the horizon as the sun. Sun and moon, they're friendly in general, but, they kind of have their own domains they want to be operating in. They don't want to rub shoulders too much, too many cooks in the kitchen. So Mars and Jupiter are both kind of without their respective monarchs or leaders, and really kind of, to some degree symbolically, without either of them. So, they're going to lean a little more bummed, a little more, a little more grumpy, a little less benefic. But they're kind of, smaller components of the overall picture. And really you want to see, what the ruling planet is doing. And you got Mercury ruling Gemini. And, Mercury's in its fall, its detriment in Pisces. Personally, I'm kind of fond of Mercury in Pisces. Often gives a very expressive, imaginative communication style, but one that's not very precise. Kind of have to be patient with Mercury in Pisces because it's not very straightforward in its communication or very naturally inclined to logic. It's a bit more emotive. I kind of liked what Robert Hand said at one point about Mercury in Pisces. By medieval standards, no planet is more essentially debilitated in any sign than Mercury is in Pisces, because Mercury is both in its domicile and exaltation in Virgo. It's technically both in its detriment and fall. Now, I think it's a little melodramatic. I would say its struggles are about on par with other planets in the sign of their fall or detriment. But he said that Mercury in Pisces is good at a lot of things, but being Mercury is not one of them. However, with Jupiter in Gemini, we got a mutual reception. Now, mutual receptions are usually helpful. Traditionally, they were said to cancel out any difficulties or challenges associated with a planet lacking dignity where it is in some way. But in practice, you tend to get both in this case. You kind of get both the challenges and the difficulties and the strengths as well. Gacy was quite good at a lot of mercurial things. Very organized, meticulous record keeper. But the logic wasn't always super straightforward. When he was arrested, after they started pulling bodies up from under his house, the cops asked him what the location of his birth was. And Gacy said, "I was born in a state of confusion." He was rather pleased with himself with his kind of clever little play on words, but quite appropriate given his first house ruler being in the 7th. Going to have some identity confusion there. Then Mercury, in its fall. It's in the 4th. It's with the South Node. It's also this kind of fresh and covered in afterbirth sort of Mercury. Like just got into the sign. Just being with the nodes is going to add, a little confusion. And then, his sun is being eclipsed. So, with that mutual reception, it's helpful. He was not ineffective at all at the things he did. Actually, an extremely busy and energetic dude. But, that Jupiter and Gemini, Mercury and Pisces mutual reception, it's a bit much. It's a bit over the top, especially with that Venus trine Jupiter, Venus in the 3rd. Even if he wasn't a serial killer, I personally wouldn't want to get caught in an elevator with him. Definitely the type to start chatting up anybody and anywhere about anything. And he was, pretty unanimously described as just a gold star blowhard, constantly bragging about all the people he knew, all these connections that he had. Really wanted to be this well-connected guy, and he was to some degree, but he shamelessly exaggerated his connections. He liked to claim that he had connections to the mafia whenever somebody pissed him off. So, you get Jupiter being Jupiter and Mercury being Mercury, just not always the best version of themselves. Mercury is out of sect by phase. It's rising before the sun, which tends to be a little more of a Mercury and Gemini quality, a little bit of more of a chatty Cathy vibe. Evening star Mercury, a little more associated with Mercury in Virgo. It's a little more deliberate and considered with its thinking process and its kind of style of communication. But, really, and this could be kind of up for debate given the sort of sign boundary involved, but Mercury is separating from a square from Saturn, an out of sign square, by about 6 or so degrees, and applying to a square with Mars, about 5 or so degrees. So this kind of looks like Mercury is besieged by malefics. And, Mercury, being ever willing to adapt to its circumstances, is going to take on some malefic qualities, arguably quite a few. So, it's not really adding necessarily kind of positive, well-intentioned significations to, what Jupiter and Mars are doing. And, with that mutual reception with Jupiter and Mercury, they're kind of a package deal. Kind of like to think of mutual receptions being like a Jay and Silent Bob sort of combination, where if you invite one to the party, the other one's going to be coming too. It's just kind of implied. Goes without saying. Sort of this kind of codependent relationship, which can be very productive, but they come as kind of a unit. So whatever's going on with one is going to be kind of going on with the other. So overall, it sort of looks like Jupiter's holding a knife, or, in this case, a rope and some handcuffs. And, Mars being with Jupiter, Mars, rules Gacy's 5th house. So Mars likes to fuck, and it also rules the 12th. So it kind of has that job of kind of working against Gacy to some degree, or sort of undoing the self, which doesn't always have to be negative, but I think it's kind of negative, especially when it's applying to the first house ruler. So, Jupiter's kind of stabilizing and saying yes to Mars, and Gacy liked to fuck. He liked to fuck a lot. It's kind of big, goofy, puffy, sleazy hornball. Mars, the 5th house ruler, is getting a lot of extra juice from Jupiter. Juice in part brewed by besieged Mercury hanging out with a south node eclipse. And obviously, that took on a increasingly malevolent and dark tone. But, what about Venus? Venus is in that overcoming trine with Jupiter, and it's, kind of not quite an orb, maybe with Mars, but, by sign, it's bonifying both of them. It's a bonifying condition, at least in theory. It should be making Jupiter and Mars good. That's what bonifying means. But let's assess the condition of Venus. Venus is in Aquarius, in the 3rd house, and about 13 degrees. It is the benefic of the sect in favor, so that's going to make it, pretty strong, or at least generally more capable of expressing itself. But, okay, it's an Aquarius. Not, a bad sign for Venus. Not really good or bad inherently. I'd say Venus generally has quite a bit to work with in the sign of Aquarius. It's a little less warm, a little more impersonal. While they tend to be very social, often having, a large group of friends, they don't tend to, have as many close friends. It's not as much inclined to developing intimacy. This could look a bit like like a free love kind of Venus, sort of equal opportunity sexuality. And I mean, that doesn't exactly miss the mark with Gacy. He liked having sex with lots of different partners. Him and his first wife, they liked to swing a bit, the little wife swapping. And, definitely gives Venus kind of a social awareness, sort of sense of tact, political correctness. Not that Gacy always practiced that publicly, but he was very much aware of what the boundaries were and knew exactly how to navigate along them and around them and through them. I mean, he was able to convince people that he had maybe just picked up off the street to trust him enough to let him handcuff them. So definitely granting Gacy a lot of social capacity, capability, and skill. He was a very effective schmoozer. But how benefic is Venus in this chart? And, like I said, it's of the sect. That's good. And it's a diurnal sign. It's an air sign. So a little less benefic in the strictest sense of the term. It's also a morning rising Venus, which, is definitely going to make Venus more expressive, more outgoing, a little more attention-seeking. But, it's not, in a night chart, not as great. It's sort of acting kind of out of step with its environment a bit. In this case, quite a bit. And, it's in the third house, which by most modern astrologers, myself included, don't see the third house as a negative house at all. It's, it's a nice house. It's maybe not the most exciting house in the world, but it doesn't deal with or inherently negative topics. But it does have that quality that all cadent houses have. There's just a lot to do. The planets there are busy. They're kind of like minutia houses. It's not necessarily the kind of busy that is incredibly productive all the time. Cadent houses tend to deal with more of the maintenance, the daily maintenance, sort of entropy management houses. And ancient astrologers took a more negative view of the third house, not really topically as much, but just, planets there were, you kind of think that they're preoccupied. They're kind of swamped with shit to do. But it was, in a technical sense, bad aspects from bad planets were capable of maltreating from the third house. And while I don't think that distinction regarding maltreatment is irrelevant at all, you can see some really malefic shit coming from good houses. But we can probably say that Venus is not flush with kind of surplus beneficence to dole out in the third. But no, these are all just kind of twigs. I think the real log on the fire here is Saturn. Venus is ruled by Saturn, which is out of sect. It's the out of sect malefic. And it's in a traditionally bad house. It's in the 6th. Now, this alone was considered a form of maltreatment. The planet where it's placed is kind of like where things start often, and the ruling planet is kind of the outcome, where it ends, where it goes. So what's up with Saturn? Saturn is, like I said, in the 6th. It's at about 24 degrees of Taurus, applying to that conjunction with Uranus. Saturn's out of sect. It's in a bad house. It's in a nocturnal, earth sign. Saturn prefers diurnal signs, air or fire, particularly air. So, the constraining, restrictive, sort of drawing in qualities of Saturn are being emphasized and made more malefic by its presence in the 6th house. And I would say, not that the conjunction with Uranus is irrelevant, but Uranus is not as capable of creating the sort of sudden change and volatility that it likes to, both in Taurus and, in a night chart. Sort of coolness of the night, sort of drawing together, settling of things, puts a little bit of a limit on Uranus's power. And Taurus, it's a sign of fixed earth. So, maybe the least prone to change of all the signs, at least not sudden radical change. I always like to think of a herd of cows with Taurus, or a herd of buffalo if you want to make it a little more majestic. But those herds are huge, and they're just kind of there, grazing, and kind of in a natural setting. They might move, they will move, but kind of slowly. They'll kind of meander to the degree that you may not actually notice them really moving. until all of a sudden they're not there anymore. So I would say that, Uranus is not as radicalizing as it might be otherwise. However, I think it points to a kind of slow building of tension that when it does hit a sort of critical mass, how does fixed Earth change? Either, by the slow movement of tectonic plates or by volcanic eruptions. So, I don't necessarily love that conjunction in Gacy's sixth, especially not ruling Venus, kind of really counteracting what would otherwise be a pretty nice Venus. Now, in theory, Venus is in the overcoming sign-based square with Saturn. There's this mutual reception there. I mean, Venus should really kind of be able to bonify Saturn to some degree, and the tension of a typical Saturn-Venus even sign-based square should really be tamped down. And really, I'd probably like it a lot more if the reception wasn't mutual in this case. Because, similar to Mercury and Jupiter, they kind of come as a package deal. And, even Venus technically having the upper hand, which does seem to, in practice, have the effect of lessening the difficulty of Saturn, at least as far as Gacy's concerned. Them kind of swapping significations back and forth. I think it kind of looks like the way it showed up for Gacy. Over time, Gacy's repressed sexuality really took on darker and darker tones until he finally snapped and stabbed someone and came all over the inside of his pants. And, that's kind of how it played out. But, even just looking at it, I still feel like, Venus should kind of have the upper hand. It shouldn't have gotten that bad. Maybe not super great, but not as bad as it got. Now, some ancient texts refer to Taurus as being a commanding sign and Aquarius as obeying, them having that kind of antitial relationship, being signs of equal rising time, and Taurus being on like the lighter half of the zodiac. It's argued by some ancient astrologers that Taurus sort of had a kind of upper hand. And I think in practice, Taurus is able to, there's a little bit more of a standoff. They can kind of look a little more like negotiation or cooperation between the two. Sometimes squares between those signs can be either kind of extra standoffish or a little more manageable, especially over time. But, that could be debated. But I think Saturn has a kind of ace in the hole that maybe tips the scale in terms of adding to the overall malevolence involved in this pair, Venus and Saturn. And that is that Saturn is applying to a conjunction with the fixed star Algol. Demon star Algol is actually not one star, but three. It's a triple star system that eclipses itself in 2.85 day cycles. Ancient Egyptian, called hour watchers, as early as about 1200 BCE, observed Algol's phases and tied them to the behavior of the gods, specifically Horus. They sort of saw Algol as like the eye of Horus, who was kind of a big deal in the Egyptian pantheon, and they really focused on the phases of Algol and the moon. Basically, when both were bright, it's an indicator of good times, but when both were dark, not so good. Eventually, Algol became associated with the constellation of Perseus and represented the winking eye of Medusa's head. Medusa's decapitated head, and being held by the triumphant Perseus. But it's really in the story of Medusa that we see where a lot of the themes and topics that get associated with Algol come from. Medusa was, in myth, once a beautiful, kind of devout high priestess, but after the god Poseidon came down and raped her, Athena, Poseidon's wife, punished her for being such a homewrecker, and turned her into an ugly old Gorgon with snakes for hair, and cursed to turn anyone she looked at into stone. And, what better way to kind of top off the villainization of a rape victim than to turn her into this horrible monster for a, big sturdy hero like Perseus to come in and build his legend by venturing into Medusa's dark underground lair, which is basically a graveyard of petrified statues, and, cutting her head off. It's kind of how Algol gets associated with decapitation and, more broadly, injuries to the neck, throat, Taurus, as well as strangulation and hanging. And there are themes of unrestrained feminine sexuality and the repression of feminine sexuality and feminine authority, powerful female figures. And, for thousands of years, people across cultures looked up at Algol with fear. This kind of winking star fading in and out of existence. And I think this really speaks to the fear that, men have had throughout human history of the power of, women's sexuality. Culture is really sprinkled with subtle and overt sort of carrots and sticks designed to control female sexuality in both men and women. And when you take it apart, it can kind of look like a kind of womb envy, maybe. When you think of the kind of extreme end of archetypally male sexuality, it's really the expression of dominance. It's penetrative, oppressive, conquering, very kind of ego-driven, perhaps more Mars-like in nature. While the kind of extreme end of archetypally female sexuality is more possessive, enveloping. There's kind of a loss of control, a surrendering, and a merging that is, both kind of longed for in some existential way, but also deeply threatening to the ego. It's a little bit like Saturn, and that's why, to the degree that you can really categorize the character of the planets in strictly feminine or masculine terms, I think there's a strong argument for Saturn being essentially feminine in nature. Now, Gacy, I think it's pretty obvious that he was frightened of his own sexuality. Whenever he was trying to come on to young boys, he would tell the story of this one time when he was out with a male friend of his, going out picking up chicks. And his friend said to him, you have about a 50% chance of getting laid tonight, but I have a 100% chance. And Gacy said, how is that? And the friend says, if I can't find a woman to have sex with, I can always find a dude. And, if you close your eyes, you really can't tell the difference. After all, it's not really gay if you're thinking about a woman while you're doing it, right? And Gacy, always insisted that he was not homosexual, and not that I would even argue that he was. It's kind of irrelevant. But what's relevant is that he really seemed to be afraid of that designation. After his second marriage, he would just kind of always insist that he was bisexual, with a strong preference for women, always with that emphasis. But, a hole is a hole, right? When you hear him talk, always say, I'm not a fag, I'm not a fruit picker, which, his dad just constantly accused him of. I find it interesting that the ruler of Gacy's first house is also the ruler of his fourth. And this could kind of be a suggestion that, maybe he has a lot in common with his father. And I think his father's kind of pervasive homophobia, alcoholism, violence towards his family could be an indication that he was maybe projecting his own, repressed sexuality on Gacy. I mean, the dude insisted on naming his son John Wayne, for Christ's sake. I mean, come on. Could just be speculating there. But, when Gacy was in prison for sodomy the first time, and he was informed of his father's death, he kind of immediately got off the phone, and the story is he saw, two dudes kind of blowing each other in prison and just started kicking them. And people that knew him kind of referenced a change in character, and he often made kind of derogatory remarks about his victims being, fags. I gave them what they wanted. He always really kind of emphasized the transactional kind of quality of his sexual relationships with men. He really didn't want anyone thinking he was, emotionally involved with any of these men. And, he also really emphasized that he never went after straight men. All his victims were gay. Like, that made it a little more okay in some way. But, I mean, when you just consider the nature of his crimes, the way that he just tortured the shit out of his victims, he really, really liked the torture. He liked to drag it out. And, a lot of the torture was very sexual in nature. When they were searching his house after finding the bodies, they found, multiple feet-long dildos covered in blood. And Gacy, really had a thing with strangulation. That was how nearly all of his victims died. And I think that's where you can really see Saturn and Algol and Taurus really altering the character of Venus. As far as I know, the only victim of his that died by anything other than strangulation or asphyxiation of some kind was his first victim, which was very much unplanned. And early on, he became fond of shoving the victims' underwear down their throats, both choking them and causing them to gag and essentially drown in their own vomit. I mean, it's really fucking twisted. It just really speaks to the level of hate that Gacy had. That, pretty obviously from a psychological standpoint was an externalization of the hate and fear that he had for his own sexuality. I mean, that's just one of the many things that we'll come up to with the ruler of the first and the seventh. Strong tendency towards projection, ultimately due to unease or, an otherizing of the self. Gacy's Saturn being in the sixth house. Interestingly, the sixth shows up as employees who made up kind of the bulk of his victims. But, it's also traditionally a house of enemies, that which works at, cross purposes to the first house. And that mutual reception with Venus and Saturn really looks like this back and forth where Venus is saying yes, Saturn's saying no. No, it's bad. Yes, it's good. Till eventually it becomes so conflated that looks like, what it looked like. So, what Venus is delivering to Jupiter and Mars probably feels good through a trine, but that doesn't mean it is good. I do want to talk a bit about what has been a very infuriating element of Gacy's chart, and that's that very cuspy Sagittarius ascendant at 1 degree, 28 minutes, which inevitably kind of raises a question as to whether, maybe he was a Scorpio rising. I mean, we have a pretty specific birth time, 12:29 a.m., so it doesn't give the appearance that it could have been rounded down or rounded up in any way. But it's not at all uncommon, particularly in, say, the 40s, for them not to get around to marking down the birth time for maybe 10, 20 minutes. And if you take his birth time back just about 10 minutes, you get a Scorpio rising chart. And you definitely get very similar themes. In some ways, it fits a little better. In some ways, not. That makes Mars the ruler of the first, and it's in the 8th. And the 8th house is like a dark house. Mars in the 8th can be pretty angry, kind of paranoid, uncertain. And hey, it's the house of death, right? And it's applying to Jupiter, so could easily take on a lot of Jupiter qualities. And, the 8th house gets associated with kind of criminal activities, things done in the dark. And you also get themes of the person in question, with the ruler of the first in the 8th, or another dark house even, like the 12th or the 6th, maybe not seeing themselves quite clearly. And then that puts Venus in his 4th house. And in some ways that looks kind of better. It's being ruled by Saturn, conjunct Algol, and, out of sect in the 7th. So signifying something difficult about the way this person relates to others, but also, one of the parents being a very harsh or negative influence. And conjunct Algol, one of the other things associated with Algol is addiction, alcoholism, and who was Gacy's dad, a mean, repressive drunk. But, you also have Venus there in the 4th, and, he got along really well with his mom. But that also shows up in the Sag rising chart. Venus in the 3rd got along really well with the siblings, and the 3rd is also has some strong symbolic resonance with the mother, being the house where the moon rejoices, the house of goddess. But, with Scorpio rising, Saturn in the 7th makes some sense too. In some ways a little more, given his kind of marriage pattern, which, seemed to kind of go well at first and then quickly fell apart due to either Gacy being caught for diddling young boys or just losing interest due to being more and more interested in raping and murdering young boys, which fits. Kind of ending up in Venus in the 4th, it's like a house of known secrets. And you can even kind of see Saturn strangling those handsome young Venus and Aquariuses and burying them where? Under his house in the 4th. But in the Sag rising chart, you get that eclipsed sun and moon in Pisces, a sign that does have on its negative side associations with alcoholism, drug addiction, escapism. The South Node also often comes with things like that. Also abusive relationships being indicated, not at all uncommon. A sun-south node eclipse in the fourth could definitely look like an abusive, alcoholic father. But, you could put that in his fifth house. Sexuality, what do you like to do for fun? It also makes Jupiter the ruler of his fifth, and Mars applying to conjunction with it. You get very kind of similar story. And I think what maybe ends up making me favor Sagittarius rising chart, one, because it's just a slippery slope when you start questioning the birth time. To some degree, you have to kind of go with what's given, especially if it makes sense. But the Scorpio rising, you get that eclipse sun ruling his 10th, which is not undescriptive. One of the early books that came out about Gacy was a book called Buried Dreams. I think is a title very evocative of both what that Pisces South Node eclipse looks like in the 4th, but also in the 5th, ruling the 10th. Sun ruling, Leo, which would be the 10th house. However, with Sagittarius rising, you get Virgo on the 10th house with Mercury ruling. And Mercury, it's in Pisces, and its detriment or fall, and besieged by malefics and applying to a conjunction with the fixed star Fomalhaut. Fomalhaut is one of the royal fixed stars. Ptolemy said that Fomalhaut was of the nature of Venus and Mercury, idealistic, psychic, handsome, neat, lovable, refined, genteel, and intelligent, said to be very fortunate and powerful, and yet to cause malevolence of sublime scope and character, and change from a material to a spiritual form of expression. Now, Fomalhaut also had this kind of association with magic, magicians, gifted storytellers, clowns, and Mercury applying to a square with Mars that rules, and coming off a square from Saturn. This kind of besieged by malefics, Mercury applying to a conjunction to Fomalhaut really looks a lot like a killer clown. Just about every news broadcast on the Gacy story began with a reference to Gacy's role as a clown, much more so than, his prominence as a local political figure, which he was, much better known for at the time, but not what he ended up being known for. And, Mercury's in the 4th doing secret activities with that kind of pile of lost souls signified by that South Node eclipse. And a lot of practicing clowns noted when pictures of Gacy and his clown makeup came out that Gacy's makeup was very sharp, used a lot of angles in his makeup, which was very unlikely to be an accident. It's kind of a big no-no, makes the clowns look scary. Clowns know that. They use nice round shapes around the mouth and the eyes. Gacy used very distinctly sharp edges. When the police were tailing him, Gacy became very aware of it and naturally, started chatting up the cops, took him out to dinner. The cops even, kind of liked him. But, he did a really good job of putting his foot in his mouth. One of the things he said was, clowns can get away with murder. If you're dressed as a clown, you could walk right up to a woman and start grabbing her titties, and they won't do anything. They'll giggle. And Gacy sharing this with the cops, thinking that it's cool. He clearly was aware of that role that a clown plays. In interviews, he said he liked it. He said it was freeing for him, allowed him to kind of act like a child. But he clearly had no sense of the sort of sanctity that a lot of actual clown enthusiasts have for clowns being this kind of sacred figure. There's a trust involved. Clowns are supposed to be, very innocent, kind of just nakedly expressive and childlike. Makes you feel safe to acting kind around them. But also makes you more receptive to seeing the absurdity of all of the social expectations that really keep people from being themselves. And you'll see clown-like figures all throughout cultures and society and history, and they have this role of kind of flouting the norms and poking fun at what are often people's most deeply held beliefs. And it's like a release for people. People need to be able to do that. Need to take a break from taking life so seriously. When you get a guy like Gacy, who is very much betraying that sort of sacred trust, it unsettles people, which is why it was so emphasized in the publication of Gacy in the news. And, his arrest really marked what became a big shift in people's attitudes towards clowns. And there were always people that were afraid of him, but now it's common. Not long after that, Stephen King wrote the book It. Now, it would certainly make sense to me if that killer clown Mercury were ruling Gacy's 10th house, especially with Neptune and Virgo there opposing the moon. Neptune didn't do too great in Virgo, during the Dust Bowl or during the Great Depression, 1938 to 1942. A lot of disappointment, a lot of disillusionment. A lot of the big dreaming going on during that time was pretty bleak, pretty scary, pretty cold-blooded. Think of the Third Reich, maybe, as an example. Opposing the moon, it's kind of something about just sort of shattering dreams, or perhaps vaporizing them, turning them to dust. Perhaps we will get more definitive answers regarding Gacy's rising sign when we apply some timing techniques in John Wayne Gacy Part 2. For now, I'd like to take the opportunity to say thank you to everyone for listening and invite you to join the very recently opened Killer Cosmos forum on Facebook, where I will be more than happy to answer any questions. And, obviously I love talking about this stuff. So I'd love to hear your ideas about Gacy's chart or any other infamous figure from true crime history. Now it's just opened, so there's nobody in it yet. So as a little incentive to help get the discussion going, the first 5 listeners to join the group and post a comment will be entered into a drawing for a free natal chart consultation with myself. And if you like the show, I'd love it if you left a review or just shared it with a friend. And I want to give a special thank you to Lionel Casillo for allowing me to use his song I Saw a Ghost Last Night in the intro. I am also happy to announce that I am now open for live consultations. And if you're interested, you can schedule one through my website, KylePierceAstrology.com. Thank you all again for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you next time for John Wayne Gacy Part 2.